All right. Well, thank you for coming out today on a busy Thursday evening. So let me tell you who I am. I'm Gideon Marcus, and I'm actually a Vista native, but I do shows all over the place. And I wanted to do a show here because this is my hometown library. We moved in right around the time the library was formed. So I actually am a time traveler. So I write from the past. I maintain a web presence called Galactic Journey. And on Galactic Journey, it is currently 55 years ago to the day. So it is, as we speak, December 5th, 1964. LBJ just won the presidency. Things are heating up in Vietnam. The Beatles are rocking out, and the Rolling Stones are on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they're not even dressed in suits. And Dean Barton's making fun of them. And because of this unique perspective that I have, living in two time periods, I know what people predicted back in the day, writing science fiction and the professional visioneers of the future, and what's going on with all of you in 2019. And so what I'm going to talk about today is what science fiction got wrong and right in the 50s and 60s, and where we are today, and how they made those predictions, and why they did or did not come true. That's what you came for, right? And if you don't like it, you get double your money back. All right. So let's start. Now, first off, let me tell you what this show is not about. This is not going to be me telling you why we don't have flying cars, or go to work in our jetpacks, or why we don't have colonies on the moon yet. Although in the Q&A session afterwards, I'll be happy to answer those questions, because I do have good answers to those questions. But this is going to be a heavier and I think more meaningful and useful topic, especially since we have members of several generations in the room today. So I'm going to start with this one. In 1945, the United States became a nuclear power and immediately tested those weapons on the Japanese, two of them. Shortly thereafter, World War II ended. And for a short period of time, the United States had a nuclear monopoly. This monopoly did not last long. By 1949, the Soviets had joined the nuclear club. In 1952, we blew up a bigger bomb called the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, thermonuclear. It wasn't fission anymore, it was fusion, the power of the sun in a bomb. And the Soviets followed a year later. Because of this, the 1950s was very much a time where nuclear war was of paramount concern, not just of politicians and of newspapers and scientists, but of science fiction as well. And much of the science fiction of the 50s dealt with some sort of nuclear holocaust, destroying the world to some degree. And our people suffering from radiation poisoning, our kids being diseased mutants and so on. And so we had serious movies like Failsafe, where one rogue bomber decided to go bomb the Soviet Union thanks to some errant blip from a computer. And of course we had not quite so serious movies, Dr. Strangelove, but at the same time, if anything, the message of Dr. Strangelove was even more poignant. And in 1962, some of us may remember this, we came to the very edge of nuclear war. The Soviet Union decided to base missiles in Cuba, which had just had a communist takeover in 1959. In 1962, there were Soviet missiles placed there. The United States found them with overflying U-2 spy planes. And we came this close. We put a quarantine around the island with our warships, making sure that the Soviets couldn't bring any more missiles in. At one point, there were American destroyers dropping depth charges on a Soviet submarine. And the members of the submarine's command, the three people in command, had to decide, were they going to launch the nuclear weapons on their submarine? And two of them voted yes. One of them voted no. And because of that, we still have a state of Florida today. Despite that, nevertheless, duck and cover drills, alarms, people building shelters in their backyards, under their homes. This was probably the biggest fear of the 1950s and the early 60s. Why didn't it happen? It's 2019 in this room, and we're all still alive. In fact, as far as I can tell, no one's doing duck and cover drills anymore. People are much more worried about earthquakes or tornadoes or terrorist strikes or whatever. Do they do nuclear drills in your school? No. Why? What happened? What did the science fictioneers get wrong? Well, a number of things happened. So the very closeness, the very nearness to the precipice that we got in 62 is the reason why we stepped back and we took a thought. And the first thing that happened was we set up a phone line between the United States and the Soviet Union. So if anything like this happened again, the other side was just a phone call away. Instead of being separated by ambassadors in an ocean and hours and days of distance. Another thing that happened was the first test ban treaties. So for years, the Soviet Union and the Americans would blow bombs above ground for everyone to see. Even in space, knocking out power lines in Hawaii, causing radiation poisoning to people who lived in Las Vegas. It was fun. And it all led to this sort of proliferation mentality. Let's blow up missiles. Let's make the missiles better. This is part and parcel of our life. And the only way, welcome. You came just in time. This is what science fiction got wrong and right. And we're talking about our very first topic, the idea that the nuclear bomb was going to destroy everything. And all the movies that came out, On the Beach was another one, Panic in Year Zero. All of these movies that took advantage of the fear that was going to happen. So there's this idea that nuclear war is suffusing our consciousness. We need to step back. And the first way to step back is to stop blowing up all these bombs. So the United States and the Soviet Union got together and signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty. The Partial Test Ban Treaty said there will be no blowing up of bombs above ground. There will be no blowing up of bombs on the ocean. There will be no blowing up of bombs in the atmosphere. There'll still be blowing up of bombs underground, because you never know when you might need to do some interesting experiments. But that said, it was a step back, and we actually launched satellites into orbit to monitor the Earth in case there was ever any flashes of nuclear testing. We enforced the peace with these test bans. And this established what was called détente. We now were normalizing relations with the Soviet Union. We were treating them as people. We established our first embassy with the Soviet Union. We started having talks back and forth. We started selling them grain. It's very hard to launch a nuclear war against someone who is feeding your people. So all those are reasons why the country is still here, and we didn't go to war. So that's what the first thing that science fiction got wrong. Let's go to the next one. Overpopulation. By the 50s, this was probably the number 2 concern of science fictioneers and scientists of the mid-century. The idea that Malthus was right. Population is going to grow exponentially, and we're going to run out of food, we're going to run out of living space, we're going to run out of raw materials, we'll be eating yeast, if not each other. We'll be living on top of each other. We'll be lucky if we have 3 cubic meters of space. This was a real fear. And there was justified, because at the beginning of the century, there was less than 1 billion people. By mid-century, there was 2 billion. It looked like there were going to be 3 billion by the end of the 60s. That's a curve that looks like this. And anyone who's taken any math knows that this curve's slope only gets steeper and steeper. What could possibly cause this to change? What is to keep us from living in cities like this, composed of giant skyscrapers, hundreds of floors high, because any less density isn't possible, because we're all shoulder to shoulder with this incredibly crushing population. Why, by the year 2000, there could be as many as 4 billion people on this planet. They thought that was a big number back then. How many is it now? Almost 8. And yet we don't feel too crowded. Why is that? A couple of things. So first, here's why the population did not continue to do this. 2 things. 1, in 1961, the first oral contraceptive went on the market, the pill. And it's amazing what happens when women are given the right to say, no, I don't want to have children. And part and parcel with that is, as countries get more developed, as we have more leisure, as we are richer, it means we have more leisure time. It means women and other marginalized populations can be educated. They want to work, and they don't necessarily want to just raise families. Those two things together made our curve go from this to this. 1961 was the last year of exponential growth. And you'll see that it's still going up, but the curve is definitely going down. The slope is. For calculus people, the rate of change is declining. Well, but the number is still going up. We expect the population of the planet to top out probably at 11 billion, with most of the population growth happening in the least developed places, Africa, India, Southeast Asia. How come we didn't end up shoulder to shoulder? Well, aside from birth control and aside from raised economic state, you also had other draconian measures. So for instance, the Chinese decided to enforce a one-child policy with, by the way, disastrous results as of today, because they found that by the 21st century, they had a huge gender imbalance. Turned out when you only can have one kid, and you have a culture that values sons over daughters, you somehow end up with more sons than daughters. And when they grow up, you end up with a bunch of sons who can't get married to women. Now, by the way, Chinese men also can't get married to men. It's illegal in China to have same-sex marriages as well. So you actually have a huge population that is lonely, unhappy, and unable to form families of any kind. What's even worse is the Chinese today have decided, well, let's have population. We need population because we have the situation where we have nothing but old people and not enough young people to support them. Turns out people aren't machines. You can't just make them want a family after generations of being told to keep their family small. So
now they're limiting it to 2 children.
Yes, now they're limiting it to 2 anyway. So anyone who wants to have kids, it still has to stop somewhere. So you get them just interested in it. So that's population. Science fiction got it wrong.
Why didn't we end up using up resources and shoulder to shoulder, though, when they thought 4 billion was a lot? Why did we not end up in little giant apartment buildings and things like that?
So the answer to that is, it turns out that 8 billion ain't so much. We were so used to 1 billion or 2 billion, what that looked like, and suburban sprawl, and we thought, well, this is society. How could we possibly be denser than that? It turns out the Earth is really big. It also turns out that through technology, we were able to come up with more ways to feed ourselves, more efficient ways to power ourselves. There's no question that 8 billion is a lot of people, and we are putting a strain on the planet, and I'll get back to that later. That said, the doomsday predictions of the 50s were incorrect for 2 reasons. One, the population didn't grow as much as they did, and even though there's more people than they thought the Earth could handle, our technology developed beyond what they thought we would be able to use at the time. So better technology, slower population growth, and that's why we aren't living in an overpopulated dystopia. But we'll get back to that. The third one, hand in hand, ironically, with too many people, is too many people out of work. So part of the reason you're able to support 8 billion people is because of increased capability of an individual person, thanks to automation. And in the 50s and 60s, everything was becoming digital. Everyone had a number, right? Your bill came on a punch card. You made your reservations on an airline through a computer. Everything was automated. And there was this worry that eventually everything would be automated. Robots would take over, even as far as stuff we considered the province of human creativity. Eventually humans would be composing our songs, writing our music, writing our novels. Maybe even we were losing our humanity, becoming more robotic as time went on, to become like our robotic overlords, losing our soul, in which case, why not lose to the robots, because what did we have? But let's face it, This isn't the real thing they were worried about. What the scientists were really concerned about was this. This is a robotic assembly line. Only takes a couple of people to run it, as opposed to Henry Ford's assembly line, which required people at every stage. What happens when you don't need people to do jobs anymore? How do people work? And there was this great concern. This had happened before. It used to be in the 18th century, how did you work? You were a farmer. You raised your own food. If you got surplus, you took it to market. Maybe you were one of the small middle class that made specialized goods for people, clothes, whatever. In the early 20th century, industry surpassed the farm, and farms themselves became mechanized. And so the percentage of people working on the farm went down, the percentage of people in industry went up. And people flipped out. When the first sock-making machines came into England in the 19th century, people panicked. 7,000 sock makers are going to go out of business. And yet, because of automation, hundreds of thousands of people could make socks. And millions of people could afford socks where they couldn't before. When the railroad came into existence in the 19th century, it meant stagecoaches went out of business. The Pony Express went out of business. But how many jobs came out about because of the railroad and servicing the people on the railroad and making the supplies that could go from town to town on the railroad? Okay, that sounds great. But we're talking industry. We're talking making stuff. What do you do when you don't need people to make stuff anymore? And people were worried because by the 50s, here's the industrial sector. However, there was another sector which is going up at the same time the industrial was going down. The service sector. When you have your basic needs met, when you have your manufacturing needs met, then you have more people who are serving in restaurants, in movies, in arts, in administration, in education. You have a soaring service sector. People retail selling the goods. Eventually, people programming the computers that optimize the assembly lines. And it turns out that the service sector generates way more jobs than industry ever did. But we'll get back to that. So why are we at record levels of unemployment in 2019? There's 5% unemployment in this country. That's essentially non-existent unemployment. Despite the fact that 60 years ago, everyone thought people wouldn't have a job. This is my favorite science fiction story. It came out in 1960. The 21st century, our future. Nobody has a job. One guy is sitting at home. All he has is his marriage is on the rocks. He's drinking. He's totally destitute. And a government guy shows up, and he says, I have a job for you, but you can't tell anybody, because so few people have jobs. Everyone's going to be jealous of you, so you cannot tell anybody. Very important job. Let me tell you what your job is. As you know, all of our buildings are held together with screws. All of our huge buildings housing our 4 billion people on the planet. We need someone to go and tighten these screws. Because if you don't, the buildings are going to fall apart. Your job is essential. You will go and tighten these screws. So he goes to work, tightening screws every night. Tightening. He's proud. He comes home. His marriage is doing better. He looks good in front of his kids. He's got confidence again. He's working in a world where no one is working.
You can't tell anybody.
He can't tell anybody. And he feels terrible because his best friend has been out of work longer than he has. And he's a wreck. Lack of confidence, marriage on the rocks, no self-esteem. One day his friend comes over and he's beaming, sunshine. I'm so happy. Really, what happened? I'm not supposed to tell anyone, but I got a job. Really, what's your job? Well, as you know, all of our buildings are made with screws. And sometimes they're too tight. So every night I go and unscrew the screws to keep the buildings from falling down. So we'll always find work if we need to. Let's go on to our next. The environment. So by the 50s, as a result of industrialization, things have gotten pretty bad. So this is what Los Angeles looked like in the 50s and onwards into the 60s. People couldn't breathe. And it's because all of our power came from fossil fuel. And we were just blowing it into the atmosphere. All of our industrial processes had toxic side effects. We were just dumping our stuff in the ocean because, the ocean's limitless. Pour it in there. You can't see it, it's not there, right? This is a river in Cleveland. It caught fire 12 times. A river caught fire. And if there was a prediction of what was going to happen to the Earth if we survive nuclear annihilation, if we survive shoulder overpopulation, if we manage to get through the crushing, soul-destroying ignominy of having no work, then surely the Earth was going to descend into an environmental catastrophe. Right? And people had all sorts of dark predictions. There were movies in the 20th century, people had, goggles on and masks. There were all sorts of books about these environmental catastrophes. No blade of grass was one of them. Just where Graybeard was one where, this was actually a result of nuclear testing, but there were other ones similar to that where suddenly no children were being born. Just this idea that the Earth was sick and we were going to die along with our diseased planet. This was something that was big in the 50s, but really came to full flower in the 60s, along with sort of the counterculture hippie back to land movement, right? What is this world doing to us? Or what are we doing to the world? And in turn, dying on it. So why doesn't it look like this today? Well, in 1969, this river, the Cuyahoga in Cleveland, caught fire for the 13th time. And it was a big deal that time. And such a stink was made out of it that as a result, within 3 years, the Clean Air Act was passed. Interestingly, in California in 1964, which is where I write from right now, California kind of led the country, as it so often does, in cleaning the environment. And one of the things they said was cars are the biggest polluters. We can talk about power plants, we can talk about factories, but the fact is millions of people are puttering around in their lead-based gas-fueled cars, causing all this smog. And so California, Governor Brown, you may have heard of Governor Brown. I think he was your governor too pretty recently. There's actually a different Governor Brown 55 years ago. Pat Brown is his father. It was more fun 2 years ago when I could say Governor Brown and no one knew which year I was talking about. So in California, they passed a law that said car companies need to use catalytic converters on their car. So you didn't need to have leaded gasoline anymore. And the car company said, oh, it's impossible. Technologically, we can't do this. No. And then California said, tough, we're passing the law. Deal with it. And it's amazing. Within months of passing the law, GM had catalytic converters for their cars. I don't know how that happened. It's amazing. They said it couldn't happen, and yet it did. These things together, these environmental watchguards and legislation, and the fact that we wanted this to happen is why things are cleaner today. When we discovered that there was an ozone hole in the 70s and 80s, do you know about the ozone hole?
Yeah.
Caused by chlorofluorocarbons, which were commonly used in refrigerators, among other things. And we got together and we said, we're going to ban CFCs. And people were like, you can't ban CFCs. They're fundamental to our economy and also our bottom line if we happen to make refrigerators. And yet, the fact that everyone didn't die of carcinoma from the sun coming from too much UV convinced us we had to do something. So that's why science fiction got this run. And so this is LA mostly today. Air is so clear you can't even see it. All right. So let's talk about that. How did these science fictioneers get everything so wrong? Right? They were sure we were going to blow up with nuclear disaster. They were sure we were going to be overpopulated, out of a job, and coughing out our last lung due to environmental problems. How were they so wrong? This is Tomorrowland, 1965, by the way. This is exactly what the 21st century looks like, right? Nothing like that. Well, I'll give you two things. One, a science fiction writer's job is not to predict the future, because no one can predict the future. A science fiction author's job is to say, this is what might happen if this goes on. They are writing cautionary tales, or sometimes aspirational tales. If we do this, then things will be so much better. You actually see that kind of science fiction a lot in the Soviet Union, because communism can't have anything wrong with it. Therefore, if we adopt communism, everything will be wonderful. Romanian science fiction may have been like that too. That said, there is a place for aspirational science fiction. So science fiction job is to tell us what could happen. And I would say the science fiction wasn't wrong. They were right, because we looked at what they were saying. We saw what was happening, and we said, not that. Let's make this happen. People of the time decided to get involved, to look around, and to make a positive change, because they saw what was happening and didn't want these fears of science fiction to come true. Now, that said, North Korea has nuclear missiles. Russia has nuclear missiles. The United States has nuclear missiles. Not particularly well maintained, I might add. Our current president is talking about breaking certain nuclear treaties. Nuclear proliferation is still a factor. India and Pakistan still have conflicts over Kashmir. Both of them are nuclear-armed nations. So were the science fictioners wrong? Or is this something that could still happen? This is India. Yes, we're not overpopulated in the United States, but there's plenty of places in the world where it's very, very crowded. And there's all of the doomsday predictions have to some degree come to pass, just not here. And they may still happen. We saw the line go down, but we don't know if that's going to be for certain. And we don't know if 11 billion people is a low enough population for us to deal with. Maybe it's a billion too many. Maybe we start having to make tough choices at the end of the 21st century. Maybe they weren't wrong in the 1950s. Maybe they were just behind on their schedule. The jobs still aren't coming back to coal country in Appalachia. What happens when service doesn't require people? What happens when McDonald's is completely automated? What happens when drones and automated cars do all of our transportation? Now, I would argue we might still be okay. So, for instance, this fellow here is a computer programmer, works for a company that I used to work for. And our company is like the service for the service sector. We actually make online tools for people to start their own companies with. So you could argue that there's a fourth sector growing. But is it going to be enough? Is it going to employ enough people? Are we going to have meaningful enough lives all doing what I call the Etsy economy, where we all write songs and make art for each other and hand them around to each other? That sounds like a great living to me. But is that what most people want? Or are most people going to sit and watch television with programs written by artificial intelligence in 20 years? So were they wrong? Or were they just early? And in the 1950s, scientists started to be worried about something called global warming. The idea that as long as we are putting all of this carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases, gases that trap the solar output of the sun after it's turned into heat, as long as we keep doing that, and industry is only going to get stronger, more prevalent to supply our population of 8 billion, then we will expect to see a corresponding temperature increase around the world. And in the 1950s, they expected that increase to be, by the year 2010 or so, to be a couple of degrees. There's a case where they were spot on. And this is still a problem. And not only is it still a problem, it's a problem we largely aren't doing anything about right now. Now, I don't think that's going to last necessarily, but we're still at a place where it could go either way. And if we want to know what a planet looks like where you have a runaway greenhouse effect, it's easy to find. There's one next door, it's called Venus. Nothing lives there. And I'm not saying that the greenhouse effect is what's going to do us in, but it could be. And there could be some other environmental issue. There could be a disease, there could be a crop blight, there could be something ahead. Something we need to look out for. So in other words, just because the environmental catastrophes of the 50s and 60s did not come to pass, does not mean there are environmental catastrophes not waiting to happen. Does everyone know what this is? This is the doomsday clock. It was invented by the Federation of Atomic Scientists in 1947. And it is a stark illustrator of how close our race is to the edge at any time. Right there at 7 minutes to midnight. I think we're at 7, it might be at 5. It goes back and forth. At one time, we were as close as 2 minutes to midnight. At one point, we were as far as 19 minutes to midnight, back when the Cold War was over and we thought, nothing to worry about now. And part of the reason it's gotten so close to midnight is not just because of nuclear destruction, which is what this was originally made for, but because of the concern specifically of global warming, but environmental catastrophe in general. The fact is, our scientists and science fictioneers are still worried. And if there's anything that this show has explained to you, I hope, is that the reason doomsday scenarios don't come to pass is not an intervention. It's us. It's us looking at what could happen and deciding we're not going to let that happen. And it's going to be up to all of us here, all of us generations, the older generations with the wisdom of the years, the younger generations who are working towards tomorrow, the youngest generations learning about these issues, even issues that the older generations might not even know exist because it's so new. It's going to be up to you to make sure that the doomsday predictions of the past don't become the realities of tomorrow, and that the aspirational good predictions of the past do become our future. Thank you very much. Now I'm happy to take any questions.
So, do you have some specifics of what, like, it's kind of a large thing to say, we gotta stop this. Do you have some specific actions that we could do personally, other than just everyone has to work to stop it?
Well, there's all sorts of doomsday scenarios, and I've pointed out 4 of them. I don't know, well, strike that. So let's talk about if, let's say, nuclear weapons are your concern, right? So, or nuclear power. Everything is going to start with research. So you find out all that you can about the issue. Find out who's working on these issues. So if disarmament is your thing, form a disarmament club. Find other people who are interested in this. Write letters to your congressman. Find out which bases are unnecessary. Pick it. Raise awareness. If you're worried about unemployment, this year is very interesting in terms of unemployment. Right now, there are people who are convinced that there actually is nothing you can do about rampant unemployment, and that it's just a matter of time before we don't have any meaningful employment for most people. Andrew Yang, this is not a plug for him for president, but Andrew Yang is the first presidential candidate who's made universal basic income his main plank. And because of him doing that, it has made it mainstream for other candidates to talk about. So you want to know what you can do about that, that's something you can research. You can send letters to people and say, this is something I support. Or you can look at other options. In terms of environmental things, there's all sorts of activism you can get into. If you want to, the leading activist right now is Greta Thunberg from Sweden, right? So she has made it her mission to combat global warming. If you want to know how to find out how to stop these things from happening, all you have to do is research them on the internet. And you will find someone who's already 2 steps ahead of you trying to stop these things. There will be nonprofit organizations, there will be activists. You are not alone in this. If something is this big, there is already a movement that is interested in stopping it, and you can join. I don't have numbers. Next question. share with the audience?
I don't remember the question that you said at the beginning. You said three things at the beginning.
Oh, why don't we have jetpacks and
Yeah,
flying
jetpacks,
cars?
exactly, yeah, the flying cars.
Sure,
yeah,
why don't we have the technology to
Yeah.
predict it? All right, so, briefly, the reason we don't fly around in jetpacks is it takes an incredible amount of energy to lift 150 pounds off the earth for any length of time. And as long as your fuel is in a canister small enough for you to carry on your back, you're just not going to get very far on a tank of gas. As for why we don't have flying cars, cars are already one of the leading causes of mortality, if not the leading cause of mortality in this country. Can you imagine if we now went to 3 dimensions?
Also because it takes an incredible amount of energy to lift 150 pounds off the ground.
Right.
Cars weigh a lot more than that.
Right, there is that too. And as far as why we have not gone to the moon, actually it's the same thing. All of these have sort of the same answer. The reason why we have not established lunar colonies spread beyond the Earth is because as long as the way you get into space is you take a giant thermos filled with gas and light it on fire, it's very expensive and you're very limited in what you can get into orbit. Until they come up with a way to go into space that is not related to the Chinese way that they made decorations in the sky for emperors, we're going to be stuck on Earth for the most part.
Do you think that will come?
Maybe. I will tell you this, when it comes, it will come in a way that no one imagined. Maybe it'll be one of those 70% of the world that is unemployed, trying to think of something interesting, coming up with the next version of Candy Crush. And they somehow come up with anti-gravity by accident. And all of a sudden, everybody will go into space because it'll be cheap. But it will not be through a refining of the current systems. We will not get into space in a big way, sorry Elon Musk, through rockets. Boy, that was a bummer. Way to end on a bummer. I had this total aspirational end and you just...
You wanted the jetpack, man. You wanted.
On the other hand, so here's something that no one predicted in the 50s. Is it a prediction that they got wrong if no one made the prediction at all? In the 50s, no one predicted that every single one of us would have a computer in our pocket. And not only just a computer, this is a terminal to every computer in the world. At the time, a computer was a really big system in a cold room managed by a priesthood of IBM or university people, right? It wasn't even until the mid-60s that they came up with the idea of time sharing, where multiple people could use the same computer at the same time. And it wasn't until the late 60s that they came up with the idea of the internet, where you could have computers that could communicate with each other from long distances, which, by the way, that came about because of nuclear bombs. We were worried that our communications would become cut by all these missiles, so we needed a decentralized way to communicate with each other. That's why the internet was formed. The internet doesn't care how messages get from one computer to another, they'll find their way to another computer. No one could have predicted that in the 50s. No one could have predicted that you would have handheld computers that not only have more power than the computers that got us to the moon, but could also talk to any other computer in the world. Back in the 50s, to call across the ocean was virtually impossible. Now you don't even think about it. You call someone in England, it's free. Or, you get your monthly bill or whatever, but it's part of your bill. Isn't that amazing? The communications is just so widespread and possible. Again, something they could not conceive in the 50s, although they did have the idea of satellite communications, which, by the way, is another place where science fiction got it right and wrong. Do you want me to go into this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Kind of a cool topic. All right. In 1945, I think, Arthur C. Clarke, science fiction author, came up with the idea of the geosynchronous communication satellite. What does that mean? If you want to send a message around the world, you either have to send it over a wire, in which case the ocean's getting away, or you have to send it via radio. The problem is, the Earth is like this. It's round. It's a new discovery we've made recently. The Earth is round. You send a radio beam, it goes straight. Now, some radio frequencies you can bounce off the ionosphere, right? So you can send them around the world. So you get shortwave, right? Sometimes AM broadcast, but mostly things like shortwave. That's great. That's very difficult to base your entire communications infrastructure on. But the problem is, if you want a tower that will go from one side of the earth to the other, it's got to be thousands of miles high. How do you build a thousands of mile high tower, especially in the middle of the water? You know, you make a satellite. You put a satellite in orbit. You put it so high up that the time it takes to do an orbit is exactly the same time that it takes the Earth to go around. And so the satellite is always in the same place in the sky, any time of day. And we did this, called SYNCOM. We also had lower satellites, Telstar. What a big impact that made. They made songs about Telstar. It was such a big deal. The idea that you could broadcast soccer matches from Europe to America. You could broadcast the Olympics from Japan to the United States. Create live via satellite. Some of you may have heard that expression. And everyone thought satellite was going to be the way we talk to each other, the wave of the future. 98% of our communication is handled on the ground. And that's because it is cheaper and easier to use cellular technology, to still use wires on the ground or wireless repeating stations. How do you get over the oceans? Underwater cables, fiber optics. We didn't have fiber optics back in the 50s and 60s. And so, interestingly enough, satellites were the wave of the future until they weren't. Now, we still use satellites. They're very useful for countries that have remote areas that you don't have service to. They're good for the military when the enemy country may not be terribly accommodating as to where you can put your wires. But for the most part, it's all done with cell phones on the ground. Science fiction got it wrong and right.
Is that true of GPS as well? Or GPS satellite based?
GPS used to be satellite based. I believe GPS is now all cellular based for the same reason. It's very easy to know where you are with respect to a cell tower that's right down the street. But the first GPS was satellite based. So it's like a 30-year period when science fiction was right. So are they wrong if they stop being right? Okay, interesting stuff. Have I satisfied everyone's curiosity? Are you glad you came? Was this worth your time? Your butt's tired? And by the way, I will make a last pitch. So one of the things I cover on the journey, in addition to space technology and politics and so forth, is I also cover science fiction. In fact, we started out as a science fiction blog. Every 2 days, we come out with an article on some science fiction magazine, or book, or movie, something exciting like that. And while I was doing this science fiction blog, I came across a bunch of really good science fiction. Not only that, but I found a bunch of good science fiction written by women. And this is interesting because these days there's kind of this idea that women didn't write science fiction back in the 50s and 60s, that it was a boys' club. And a lot of people can't name science fiction authors from the time, other than a few people like, say, Lee Brackett, or Ursula K. Le Guin, or Anne McCaffrey. I found 36. And I took 14 of the best stories, and I put them in a book. And then I got an army of current women science fiction authors and creators, and had them write introductions, so they all had context. And this book is really cool, and it's selling really well, and it's in over 100 bookstores now. So, if you're interested in this amazing book, feel no obligation, but one, it's great for yourself, and it makes a good Christmas present, or Hanukkah, or Kwanzaa, or Festivus, or the solstice. In fact, you should buy one for every one of those holidays, because you never know which one your friends are going to want. Anyway, they're $15 on Amazon today. You can have them for $15. But this time, they come with my scribbling in it. All right. Thank you very much.
So that's just the site, Galactic Journey?
That's it.